With the Soviet Union growing more bold in their push to spread communism around the world, it was inevitable that the Truman Doctrine would eventually be tested internationally. Sending monetary aid was not enough in some cases. Free nations would need military support in order to resist communism. But the United States and the Soviet Union were hesitant to go to war directly with each other. Because of this, the 4 decades of the Cold War would include a series of proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. A proxy war is a conflict in which the Soviet Union and the United States would back a side that they preferred and would fully support them with economic and military aid. The two sides involved in the conflict would fight it out, and a victory of the side supported by one of the superpowers would be a victory for that superpower's ideology. It was a way for the United States and the Soviet Union to compete with each other on the world stage without directly having to go to war. These proxy wars would be fought all over the globe during the course of the Cold War.
The first proxy war of the Cold War took place in China. For decades, China had been divided between two different factions. The nationalists were the pro-democratic ruling party, popular with landowners, and the communists. The communists were the opposition party and were popular among the peasantry. Each one of these groups was backed by one of the superpowers. The nationalists were led by Chiang Kai-shek and were backed by the United States. The communists were led by Mao Zedong and backed by the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that Chiang's regime was corrupt, the United States still backed them. The reason for backing them was to stop communism at any cost. During World War II, Japan had taken sections of China, but by 1945, the Chinese had defeated the Japanese and drove them out of the country, where the communists took control of northern China. Millions of peasants flee to the communist faction, and this made Mao Zedong very powerful. With this, a civil war breaks out between the two factions. The United States sends $2 billion in aid to help the nationalists. Truman was unwilling to send U.S. troops to help defeat the communist forces. Behind the scenes, the United States and the Soviet Union were backing their sides without direct involvement. In 1949, the nationalist regime collapses, and Mao's communists seize all of China. Chiang and his government flee to the island of Taiwan, which is an enemy of China to this day.
Americans were horrified that the policy of containment had failed in China. How could the United States allow communism to overtake China? President Truman took heavy criticism for the fall of China to communism, and he was determined not to allow it to happen anywhere again in Asia. His resolve, and the resolve of the United States to contain communism, would be immediately challenged again when civil war breaks out in the country of Korea. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Japan is driven out of Korea, and the Allied powers decide to divide it between North and South. Divided along the 38th parallel, 2 separate countries developed. The first country was South Korea. South Korea existed below the 38th parallel, and it was a democratic republic. Its capital was the city of Seoul. The second country was North Korea. North Korea existed above the 38th parallel. It was a communist state, and its capital city was Pyongyang. Each side was backed by one of the world's superpowers. South Korea was headed by Syngman Rhee and was backed by the United States. North Korea was headed by Kim Il-sung and was backed by the Soviet Union.
In 1950, with minimal U.S. troops in South Korea, the Soviet Union thinks the United States won't defend it. Using Soviet supplies, North Korea invades the South to make all of Korea communist. Days after the attack, North Korean troops had driven deep into South Korea. With Seoul captured, South Korea pleaded for the United Nations to help them. With a vote by the UN, the United States sends over 500,000 troops to South Korea. Truman was determined not to allow containment to fail as it did in China. In September of 1950, led by General Douglas MacArthur, the UN counterattacked. Momentum swings as the UN troops push North Korean troops across the 38th parallel. 50% of North Korean troops surrendered, and the UN troops pushed north to the Chinese border. Threatened by the proximity of the UN ground forces, the Chinese joined the war. Over 300,000 Chinese troops overwhelm the UN forces and drive the front back to the 38th parallel. For 2 years, the two sides fiercely battled to a bloody stalemate. Neither side could make advances beyond the 38th parallel, the pre-war border. MacArthur lobbied Truman to authorize an all-out nuclear war on China. He was convinced Korea was where the United States must make a final stand against communism.
Truman fiercely rejected the nuclear option proposed by General MacArthur, knowing that it would eventually lead to World War III with the Soviet Union. MacArthur's plan involved using up to 50 atomic bombs to lay a permanent nuclear belt across the 38th parallel, a belt that neither side would ever dare approach again due to radioactivity. Stubborn and egotistical, General MacArthur goes over Truman's head with his plan. Using his war hero popularity from World War II, The general appealed directly to the American public and to Congress. This was an act of insubordination against his commander-in-chief. Refusing to be undermined, President Truman fired Douglas MacArthur for insubordination. The move shocked the country, but showed the president's power under the Constitution as commander-in-chief and the leading military officer in the U.S. Armed Forces. With MacArthur out of the way, Truman worked to negotiate a peace in Korea. Surprisingly, in 1951, the Soviet Union suggested a ceasefire in the conflict. This brings about the 1953 armistice. Brokered by the United States, the Soviet Union, and by China, both sides agreed to a truce. Both sides agreed to establish the 38th parallel border, the border that existed before the war. They also agreed to a demilitarized zone at that border. Neither side was allowed to station troops or armaments at this border. Ironically, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea is the most militarized zone in the world today. From the US standpoint, the war was a stalemate because neither side won. However, containment had worked. North Korea had invaded the South in order to spread communism, but they had been pushed back successfully by US and UN troops. Still, the war proved unpopular in the United States because it didn't end in a decisive victory. The Korean War cost the United States 54,000 lives and $67 billion. It became known as the Forgotten War because so many veterans weren't recognized as they had been in World War II.
So why does it matter? It led to the creation of SEATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, in Asia to contain communism. SEATO is similar to NATO, but takes place in the Pacific. It also establishes the rivalry that the United States has with North Korea and China today. North Korea is one of the United States' biggest perceived threats today because of the distrust created during the Korean War. You will frequently hear the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un talk about launching missiles toward the United States, all because of a conflict that happened in 1953.